Welcome. This is June 19th, and today we're here with Tom Ryan, and Tom Ryan remembers some of his memories. And today's topic is Mexico and a trip to Mexico, right?
Right. Sounds good. That was a wonderful trip. We lived in the house on Hampstead, and we had built, and the kids, all of you, came at different times and stayed with us, and it was a happy place. But when I said I want to take one more trip, adventurous trip, and Marilyn was not interested at all. She was she with her diabetes and so on. She just said, "You go on it and do it." And it's fine with her. So I took a gym bag and I put some changes of underwear and so on in it, and went off to Mexico. I flew from Denver to El Paso, Texas, and El Paso is a very interesting town, pretty big town, and it's right on the border with Juarez on the other side of the Rio Grande. And every day, thousands of people come across the border into the United States to work and go back home at night, and the same on both sides. And there are large numbers of Mexicans come and do cleaning and hotel work, and mostly women, but all kinds of jobs are done on both sides of the border by both. So it's really an international city, and building a wall and the idea of Mexico is just ridiculous there. Anyway, I walked across the border after staying overnight in El Paso and walked into Mexico along with all the other people exchanging countries that morning. And I took the guidebook, and I had two wonderful guidebooks in English, of course, and we went. I went into Mexico on the blue bus recommended in the guidebook, and it took me to the bus station. And Mexico has a wonderful bus station all over the country, a bus system, and they have first-class buses, and they have television screen for every seat, and they're just very comfortable and A1 service. And so I would take a class, and then inexpensive too. And so I took the bus from Juarez, and it was full of young men who obviously were commuting back and forth from home or their villages to a big city of Juarez, and some of them going into the United States to work. And Mexico's a wonderful place to live, but it's such a poor country, and the wages are too low, and so there's a lot of poverty, but it's a wonderful place. I considered moving to Mexico in retirement, as many Americans have. 20,000 of them lived in San Luis Potosí, and San Luis Potosí is in the middle of Mexico and a silver mining country, and has buildings that date back to the first conquest by the Spanish of the Mexicans and the discovery of silver. Then it fell into hard times, and the buildings were just left derelict, and then they were revived again in modern times. And 20,000 Americans live down there, and they think it's just great as long as you don't get sick. They have insurance where you can get a jet plane that'll take you back to the United States if you need to use your Medicare. But I'm talking about just me going down. It was about 30 years ago, and so I got on the bus in Juarez, in this beautiful bus station, and brand new, and took the bus to San Luis Potosí, which going right down the middle of Mexico. And we had gone to San Luis Potosi on our first trip when the kids were little to Mexico, and stayed in a motel right in the middle of town. And they put us right in the middle of the courtyard, this fancy motel. And we were even had to wash our clothes in a dishpan and hang them out on a line on the outside of our camper and trailer. And I couldn't figure out why this fancy hotel would let us American campers come into the middle of their motel. But I think we were entertainment. I think the rich people must have sat on the balcony or in their rooms and watched us carry on out there with our daily lives, because it was all out in the open. I remember they had
Uh, your your solo trip. Your solo trip. We can cover the family trip to Mexico in another episode. Okay.
Oh, okay, right. So I'm alone, and I'm going toward Mexico City, and and again, every bus station is deluxe and wonderful and clean. And I arrived in Mexico City, and I read in this guidebook that the most likely to be attacked or mugged would be a single man traveling alone, middle-aged man traveling alone, and that was me. So I was very careful not to go out at night. I was sightseeing so much during the day that I was exhausted by night anyway and needed sleep. And so I just made it a rule not to go out after dark. But I did in Mexico City. I went to the Zocalo in the middle of the Mexico City, where the Aztec capital had been, and the new Spanish capital was built on top of the ruins of the Aztec capital.
Now, Zocalo, doesn't that mean market?
Well, in this case, it was the government center, and it was a big parade ground right in with all the Capitol buildings around it, which is common in Mexico. There's churches usually on one side and public buildings all around, and then the residents would live on outside of that ring. And so that was the center of town. And in Mexico, that's the capital and the biggest city. So they had a big ceremony when it came time to take the flag down, what they call retreat in the army. But they would have a band come out and play, and they lowered the flag very ceremoniously and slowly, and the people all sang their national anthem, and I got in on all of that, very patriotic. And then it was time to go to bed, and so I would go into I would get a hotel right on the public square, and I could go out on a balcony and look down into the public square. It's where Diego Rivera painted murals. He was Mexico's probably most famous painter, and they had a lot of famous painters and artists. And I think in Mexico, they say that one son has to become a priest, and one son in the aristocratic families, and one becomes, and usually then becomes a bishop. One becomes a soldier and becomes a general, and one of them must build museums, because the museums in Mexico City are just gorgeous. Architecturally, the buildings, and as well as the paintings, and many rich Mexican boys become artists. And so they have great art. And so I would go through the museums in the daytime and see this wonderful painting. But Diego Rivera was a communist, born probably around the turn of the century. And actually, and he was born in the middle of Mexico in San Luis Potosí, which I mentioned before. And we saw him as a young boy there in that museum. But in Mexico City, his paintings were most prominent. And they were painted on the walls in the palace that surrounded the central city square. And I enjoyed seeing those pictures. So you found some pictures of that. I'm amazed that you found them, because I looked and looked and couldn't find any pictures of Mexico.
Those were pictures of Diego Rivera, just pulled up from Google. Yeah.
Diego Rivera married Frida Kahlo, and she was, you made her, helped her become a great artist in her own right. They had a very tempestuous marriage, and they lived outside of the Mexico City in the suburbs. And there's a subway in Mexico City, a wonderful modern subway. And I took the subway out to the town where they lived, and they would fight so much that they each got separate homes. They were only a couple of blocks from one another. And during the communist revolution in Russia, the Communist Party split into two parts, with Stalin running one part and
Lenin? Lenin? Yeah. Trotsky.
Trotsky, no, yeah, Leon Trotsky. Oh, I
Right.
got it. I'm sorry, my memory's going. Leon Trotsky had nowhere to go, and he had lost out, and he would have been killed if he had stayed in Russia. So he was asking, would any country take him? And nobody would. So but finally, the Diego Rivera convinced the Mexican government to take him in. So he came and lived, and he built a house right there near Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. And he even had a tower in the house where a guard could stand and look and see anybody coming to try to assassinate him. And so he was good friends then with the Diego Rivera. And in fact, he had a love affair with Frida Kahlo. So they were in, eventually, Stalin sent an executioner who had been a mountain climber and knew how to use an axe that would poke into the ice to so you could climb up into the mountains. And he used that axe to kill. He got his way into the house, and he executed
Trotsky,
Leon
right.
Trotsky.
Yeah.
And so Trotsky became then, he wasn't a very nice man, he really wasn't, but there were a lot of followers that didn't like what was going on in Russia to the communists. They were communists outside of Russia, became Trotskyites, and they said they followed Trotsky's ideas that were less brutal than Stalin's. And during Stalin's rule, of course, most communists outside of Russia gave up their belief in communism. But there were quite a few that still followed Trotsky's ideas, which on paper sounded good. Of course, so did Stalin's on paper. It was the execution that was the problem. So I got to go through both the homes and see how they lived and did their artwork. And that was a wonderful experience. And then went back on the subway and saw, went back to the central part of Mexico City before coming home. But Cuernavaca was another town just south of Mexico City, which had a lot of Diego Rivera's art and other artists. And it was a craftsman, jewelry making, quite a beautiful city in Cuernavaca. And the weather in Mexico, it was not hot, even though it was far south, because it was high. It was something like 8,000 feet above sea level in Mexico City. So even in the summertime, we found we had to wear sweaters and jackets, and I did there. Here's some more pictures of Mexico City. So it was really a wonderful trip. And I would often, because I couldn't speak Spanish, I'd go into the city square and I would sit on an outdoor restaurant table and drink beer and watch the people, because everybody came through on their way home from work or whatever. They'd always go through the central square just to see what was going on. And school kids with their uniforms, going to Catholic school, would come through and walk through the central square. So I had taught school, and watching those kids was very interesting how they behaved as compared to American students. Much more shy, more they would be sometimes boisterous and noisy, but they were always looking at the girls out of the corner of their eye and so on. They're pretty crude about it. They were inexperienced at it compared to American teenagers. But so I could always order a meal. I knew enough Spanish to do that, and I could get a room and from the guidebook and have the cab take me there, and then I would go and rent the room. I could make the deal with the clerk and using my Spanish. And usually I stayed in inexpensive hotels because they were in the center of town, and they're much more interesting watching the people and seeing the people more than where the fancy hotels on the outskirts were mostly for tourists. So I stayed where a Mexican tourist would stay. And I hardly ever met anybody that spoke English, or it was from the United States.
So during the day, did you do lots of walking or taking taxis or?
Yeah, I could take a taxi almost anywhere. From the bus station, I just get in and give the name of the hotel, and then and I'd always ask them, how much does it cost to go there before we started out. It was usually very inexpensive. There were a lot of taxis, and so there was never any problem getting around without a car, as long as I stayed in the cities. And we had seen the outskirts of family when we had a camper. Then we'd stay on the outside of the city.
What was the most memorable event of your trip there?
I really, as I remember it, seeing that lowering of the flag in the public square with all the people around singing their national anthem. And they do that every night. They love their country. They're very patriotic. They had a hard time getting to be their independence. There were a lot of false starts and mistakes that were made. Mexico, one of them was having a war with the United States, but that was mostly an invasion by Americans. And then America took a third of their country away. We now call California, Arizona, Texas, and the Mexican War. But finally, the Mexicans did get their independence and really were able, without foreign interference, to run their own affairs. But not until 1860s or so did that really happen. So they were very patriotic, and I think that was probably the most moving vision. While I was in the hotel close to the square, I could even look from the balcony into the square. They had a demonstration. I'm not sure what it was about because I couldn't understand them, but they had a large number of people marching down the street, much as the demonstrations that we've had in this country recently. So
Yes.
I got to watch those even in the evening, but I didn't go out at night. And I ate in restaurants, and I would take a long time to eat because I just wanted to watch the people, and that was my way of travel. So I enjoyed it very much, and then came back the same way back to El Paso and flying home.
Yeah.
It was my last real adventure, and it was a good one. But I wish that I'd had somebody with me. And Barbara and I have gone to Mexico several times.
Which is a good. This is a good place.
Trip.
Yeah, for another episode. Yes. So
Okay.
yeah, I think that this is good. Your how do you say it? Views are reflected a lot in a very famous movie called Roma, which is the name of a famous neighborhood in Mexico City. And this movie won the Oscar a couple of years ago.
Right. Oh, yes.
And it's black and white.
That's right, in the middle of Mexico City. Yes, that's a wonderful movie.
Yeah.
And it's called, the name of the movie?
Roma.
Roma. Now that means Rome, but it was the name of the neighborhood where he grew up, the movie maker.
Right.
And so he wasn't talking about Rome in Italy. He's talking about a community or neighborhood in Mexico City.
And yeah, I guess has street level views of a lot of things that you were talking about. It was probably about the same time too.
Indian made and the
right. Okay. Anyway, so we need to wrap this up, and we'll continue on another episode. Thank you.